this video, we're going to talk about the difference between independent and dependent variables. In any type of scientific experiment, it's important to have these two variables identified before you actually start an experiment, so that way you know actually what you're testing. So quick review, if we're looking at independent variables, okay, independent variables are something that you change in the experiment. I always remember it as I, the scientist, change something, right? So I and I. So I want to make sure that I only change one factor in the experiment at a time. That way, if I see something change in my results, I know it's because of the one thing I changed. Okay, on the flip side, we have what's called a dependent variable. Now, the technical definition of a dependent variable is changes in response to the independent variable, which that can kind of sound a little confusing at first. So an easy way to think about it is your dependent variable is always what you are measuring, right? So another kind of way of saying this is I change something in group one, I'm going to see something else change because of what I initially changed. Right, so these two things are pretty tricky for students at first when they get started. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few examples. Let's go ahead and run through a few examples here. So if we're looking at this example, it says, does soil type influence bean stem growth? I, as a teacher, I find it easier to identify the dependent variable first, and it's always what we're measuring, right? So we look at the example, we're going to measure bean stem growth here. Okay, for our independent variable, remember our independent variable is something that's changing, right? So in this experiment, I'm going to be changing the soil type. I'm going to change the soil type to see if it influences my stem growth. Right, so it's important to notice that there's a lot of different ways that you could phrase this. You could say type of soil, whether the soil is sandy or rocky, right? There's a variety of different things. It's important that you don't just say soil, though, because I could argue, are we talking about how much soil? The color of the soil? No, we're talking about what type of soil is going to affect my bean growth. Okay. Example number 2. Which laundry detergent removes stains more effectively? Okay, going with our dependent variable. Our dependent variable is what we're measuring, right? So I'm going to measure something about the stains. So again, there's a variety of ways that we could discuss this. We could talk about, I think something easy to say, probably the amount of stains. You could say the amount of stains on clothes, right? Again, you can't just say stains because I could argue how large they are, what color, if they faded or not. So we want to be as clear as humanly possible whenever we're discussing these examples. Okay. For my independent variable is something that I change. Okay. My independent variable, I'm going to change which laundry detergent I use. Okay, let's go ahead and skip down just one because we're getting kind of crowded up here. Let's look at number 5. Okay, a student wonders if a student gets more bored if the teacher talks more in class. Now, this example is a little bit more wordy, right? So a little more complicated, right? So again, let's go ahead and take a look at our dependent variable first. What are we measuring here? What we're going to measure is we're going to measure something about the boredom of the students. That's ultimately what we want to determine, right? So we could say this amount of boredom. You could also say how bored the students are. Again, any type of phrasing similar to that. For my independent variable, okay, my independent variable again is what I'm changing. So what can change this experiment? Well, we want to see if the teacher talking more or even less is going to impact my dependent variable. It's going to impact the amount of boredom my student has. So my independent variable is going to be the amount of talking. Again, you can say the amount of talking the teacher does, anything of that example. Okay, number 6, if we're looking at Apple, something very common that we all use, our headphones and our volume. We're all guilty of listening to our headphones too much. Okay, so it says Apple tests to see if hearing loss is caused by the volume on an iPod. Okay. Looking at my dependent variable we're measuring. In this scenario, we want to measure the amount of hearing loss. Right, and actually I'm going to just go ahead and make it a little more clear and put amount of hearing loss. Okay. For my independent variable, what's going to be changing in this example? The only thing that's changing about this is my volume on the iPod. Again, let's kind of flash back to our definitions here so we don't kind of lose track of that. Right, again, so based on this, my independent variable is something that I change. Based off what I change, something, known as my dependent variable, is going to change in response. Right, so looking at number 6 off our example we just did. Okay, let me go ahead and erase a little bit, kind of clear the field for us here. Right, so in this situation, I'm going to change the volume on my iPod. As a result, the amount of hearing loss, if any, will change. My independent variable impacts my dependent variable. Let's go ahead and do just 2 more. Let's go ahead and do this one. Number 8 says, you wonder if the amount of brain cells you have is affected by the amount of time you spend watching America's Got Talent. Okay, so if we look at our dependent variable is what we're measuring. We want to know if we're affecting the amount of brain cells, right? So an easy way to always tell for our dependent variable is look for those keywords: amount, measure, counted, uh, collect, something along those lines. Those are kind of our keywords to tell us, hey, we're measuring that, right? So that's going to be our dependent variable, right? So our dependent variable here is going to be amount of brain cells. And again, I don't just want to put brain cells. I want to put amount because I could argue how large they are, the shape of them, the color of the brain cells. Right now, I'm measuring the amount of brain cells. For my independent variable, what am I changing from group to group here? I'm going to be changing the amount of time, right? So I want to see if the amount of time I change impacts the number of brain cells I have, right? So my independent variable is going to impact my dependent variable. Right, I'll kind of get this all out of the way here. All right, let's just do one more before we wrap up. Let's go ahead and do number 12, right? Because we're in biology, we'll talk about cells all the time. So number 12 says cells are exposed to different amounts of salt to see if they will grow or shrink in size. Okay. Let's go ahead and do the independent variable first, right? Because some people find it easier to find the independent variable. So we have to look at the situation and say, what are we changing in this situation? Okay. For independent, remember independent I change. I'm going to change the different amount of salt that the cells are in. Right, so my independent variable is going to be the amount of salt. You could phrase it how much salt is used, how much salt the cells are exposed to, anything of that nature. Okay, and then my dependent variable, what I'm measuring, right? I am changing the amount of salt, and I want to measure if they grow or shrink in size, right? So an easy way of saying that would be cell size. Or size of cells, something along the lines of those. All right, so again, flashback to our main definition. Just one more time. Our independent variable, if I could scroll down here. Okay, my independent variable is something that I am specifically changing in the experiment. Okay. I is I change. I, the scientist, change one thing. Okay. And it's important we only change one thing. Based off this one thing I change, something else is going to change, right? Something that I'm measuring is going to respond. It could be if I'm looking at my soil, right? If I change my soil type, well, that's going to impact my bean stem growth, right? If I look at my laundry detergent example, if I change my type of laundry detergent, well, that's going to have an impact on the amount of stains I have in my laundry, right? So it's very, very important that we as scientists have these identified uh, going into an experiment before we actually conduct it. That way we know what we're looking, we know how we're measuring our results, and everything of that nature.